So, there's this massive trade deal brewing between India and the European Union, and believe me, it has the power to totally reshape the global economy. So, what's the big deal? Well, let's break it down. You know, something is huge when officials in both New Delhi and Brussels start calling it the mother of all deals. I mean, when you hear normally buttoned up diplomats using language that strong, it's a huge sign that something truly transformative is happening here. And just how big are we talking? Well, this economic bloc, India and the EU combined, represents about a quarter of the entire world's GDP. That's a market of nearly 2 billion consumers. The economic pull of that is just immense. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into why this agreement is being called such a watershed moment. First up, let's look at what actually makes it the mother of all deals. A deal this big definitely didn't happen overnight. I mean, look at this timeline. Negotiations actually kicked off way back in 2007, but then they stalled for almost a decade. It wasn't until 2022 that a major push got them back on track. This journey, nearly 2 decades long, just goes to show you how complex and high stakes these talks have been. All right, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of it all. What's actually in this thing for each side? Let's take a look. At its heart, this is really a complementary partnership. For India, it's all about getting incredible access to the huge EU market. We're talking a staggering 99.5% of its exports facing almost no tariffs. And for the EU, it's like getting a golden ticket into India's booming consumer market with taxes coming way down on things like cars, machinery, and chemicals. Now here's where things get really dramatic, especially for India's textile and apparel sector, which is a massive employer. Tariffs that were as high as 12% are literally dropping to zero. Just think about that. This one change alone could boost exports by billions and is expected to create millions of jobs. And it's not just textiles. We're seeing huge wins across some of India's most important labor-intensive industries. Look at leather and footwear. Tariffs were up to 17%. Marine products, a crazy 26%. All of that is going to zero. This finally levels the playing field for India against competitors like Bangladesh and Vietnam, who've had this kind of preferential access for a long time. But you know, a deal of this magnitude is about so much more than just tariffs and quotas. So let's zoom out a bit, look at the global chessboard, and see what the profound geopolitical consequences really are. And you can bet this did not go unnoticed in Washington. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent came out with some pretty sharp criticism, basically accusing Europe of putting business interests ahead of strategic partnership. This really shows you there's a deep anxiety in Washington over this deal, because it kind of messes with their own trade and sanctions plans. You know, this pressure from Washington perfectly highlights a core principle of Indian foreign policy: strategic autonomy. This whole deal is a masterclass in that idea. By signing with the EU while its own talks with the US are still up in the air, New Delhi is sending a crystal clear message: we're not putting all our economic eggs in one basket. And then there's the other major geopolitical factor here, China. For both India and the EU, this agreement is a massive piece of the China plus one strategy. It's all about de-risking, right? Building supply chains that aren't so incredibly dependent on just one country. It creates a powerful economic alternative. So while the benefits are obvious, the deal isn't without its challenges. And that brings us to the hidden hurdles. Let's explore the catch in this agreement. So the catch really lies in something called non-tariff barriers, or NTBs. See, even when you cut tariffs to zero, a country can use all sorts of complex regulations and standards to block trade just as effectively. And let me tell you, the EU is a world leader in these kinds of barriers. You've got things like CBAM, which is basically a carbon tax on imports. Then there's EUDR, a strict set of rules about deforestation, and another directive that forces companies to audit their entire supply chains for environmental and human rights risks. For Indian exporters, these complex rules could totally wipe out the gains they just got from the tariff cuts. So this has kicked off a huge debate. Are these just neutral environmental and labor standards designed to help the planet? Or are they a clever new form of green protectionism, basically trade barriers dressed up in the language of sustainability? That's the billion-dollar question hanging over this deal. So where does all this leave us? Well, in our final section, let's look at India's big strategic shift and what this deal signals about its new economic playbook on the world stage. Now, there's an interesting argument that these really tough EU standards, while they're a huge challenge, might actually force a standards upgrade across Indian industry. The idea is to get into that super profitable European market, Indian manufacturing will have to get a major quality overhaul. It's sometimes called the Brussels effect, and it could end up making Indian goods more competitive everywhere, not just in the EU. And that connects perfectly to how the Indian government is framing this whole thing. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's vision is that this isn't just about exports. It's about transforming the entire domestic economy, linking free trade to jobs, new skills, and the national mission of self-reliance, what they call Atmanirbhar India. So that brings us to the final and most important question. This agreement is way more than a trade pact. It's a strategic alignment, it's a geopolitical statement, and it's a spark for domestic change. The real question we have to ask is, could this be the deal that ultimately defines India's role in the 21st century economy?